Los Angeles Review of Books. I'm Colin Marshall, coming to you from LARB headquarters, speaking today with Eric Lax, author of books on penicillin, on bone marrow transplantation, on Woody Allen, on Paul Newman, and most recently with Robert Peter Gale, MD, radiation, what it is, what you need to know. Subject obvious. Eric, from having written books on medical science before, tell me about the state of your knowledge of radiation before this project officially began with Bob Gale.
I started this project, I think, with the same amount of knowledge about radiation as almost everyone, which is to say basically nothing. I knew it was out there. I was not aware that virtually everything is radioactive, including us, just that some things are more radioactive than others. And I hadn't realized that the role that radiation plays in our lives, really without radiation, we don't exist. We need it for photosynthesis. It gives us the very basis of our life. If that doesn't happen, we're not here. If Earth is 50 or 100,000 miles farther or closer to the sun, life as we know it doesn't exist. So it really is basic to our lives. We think of it as something that to be feared, and it certainly is something to be feared. But it's also something that's absolutely necessary for what we do, and we just need to understand the balance between the two of them and where it's helpful to us and where we can take precautions to not have it hurt us. This metaphor appears nowhere in the book, but double-edged sword, that's a fair assessment? Sure. It is. So that, it helps us in any number of ways, but also, overexposure can cause cancer. We know that radioactivity, excess radiation causes cancer. What's sort of shocking about it is that how tolerant the human body is that not the same dose given to every person is going to end up in the same way. That can also have something to do with age. The one of the things about radiation, especially when we're dealing with something that may cause cancer, is that cancers from radiation often take a long time to grow, 20, 30, 40 years. So that the dose, you can receive, if a 3-year-old, for instance, and an 80-year-old receive exactly the same dose of radiation, what happens to the 3-year-old will be much different than what happens to the 80-year-old.
It could be worse for the 3-year-old.
Much worse for the 3-year-old. 80-year-old probably isn't going to live long enough for the effects of it to do any harm. They'll die from something else. A 3-year-old has plenty of time for these things to take place, or a 10-year-old or a 15-year-old. But that something happening early in life, there's a longer period for something to occur as a result of the radiation.
That, I think, I count among, when I tell friends about what I learned from this book, the fact that the fact that somebody young can be more harmed by radiation than somebody old is one of the surprising facts that I rattle off. Others would include, what surprised me most, that for certain types of skin cancer, sunscreen is not particularly helpful. That's a bit of a side point, though. One of the points that I think people know but don't think about very hard is that moderate amounts of radiation hurt. High amounts of radiation, that has a higher chance of helping you if it's directed at, for example, cancer.
Right. A moderate amount of radiation can, in fact, cause changes in a cell that can lead to cancer. But a larger amount of radiation will kill the cancer cell. A dead cell can't cause cancer. So that, in fact, a smaller dose can give you cancer and a larger dose can cure it. And in a certain way, it doesn't make any sense, but unfortunately or fortunately, it's the fact.
Tell me what makes this book especially worth having written today. I mean, obviously there's references to the Fukushima Daiichi explosion, to Chernobyl before that, but it's more than the fear that people have about radiation is driven by more than nuclear reactor disasters, right?
Yes, although they're a very good place to hang your fears on. Yeah. And I've written this book with Robert Peter Gale, who is the American physician who went to Chernobyl and treated victims of radiation there, did bone marrow transplants on the most severely injured firemen who had rushed into the reactor number 4 at Chernobyl, thinking they were putting out a fire, and suddenly found that they were exposed to massive amounts of radiation. He's been involved with the follow-up of Chernobyl for the nearly 27 years since it happened. He's also been a medical advisor at virtually every nuclear accident of any consequence since, and was very involved with Fukushima, so that he worked with Japanese scientists to really figure out what is the risk going forward for people around Fukushima and in Japan. And the answer is, surprisingly, I think to many people, virtually nil. There expected to be few, if any, cancers following up from the Fukushima disaster.
And this co-author of yours, Robert Peter Gale, if I have this correct, he's also a college classmate of yours, is he not?
Yes, he's a college classmate of mine, and we were briefly fraternity brothers before I dropped out of the fraternity. So we've known
him well then?
I knew him pretty well then, and then in 1981, I guess, I started. I wanted to do a book about the frontier of science, and I ended up on the bone marrow transplant unit at UCLA, which he ran at the time. This was before he had gone to Chernobyl. I spent the better part of a year on that. I was really curious about what happened at the frontier of medicine, what happens to the patients, but also to the doctors and the nurses who treat them, and why people go through such extraordinary physical trauma, in some cases, as in a bone marrow transplant, and are willing to risk that. And that was a utterly fascinating period of life. And one of the things I learned on there is if the leukemia is one of the diseases, of course, you get a bone marrow transplant for. When you see somebody in end-stage leukemia, what's called blast crisis for one of the kinds, you can understand why someone would be willing to perhaps risk a bone marrow transplant in which you have your immune system killed, your blood-producing cells knocked off, and someone else's put into your body.
And since that time, have you and Dr. Gale been talking about writing a book? Is it sort of like we've got to do a book, or we've got to do a radiation book? Moreover, what was this conversation?
Yeah, Bob and I in 2011 had spent 7 months trying to get a dinner date, a time for us where we and our wives could get together for dinner. I travel a lot; he travels all the time, and so we were never together in the same place. Right after Fukushima, I was in Australia for a book event, and I had read in the paper that Bob had gone to Fukushima, and I sent him a note saying, good luck there, and let's have dinner when you get back. And I got a letter from John Siegel, my editor at Alfred A. Knopf, saying, "Do you know where Bob Gale is?" And I said, "Actually, I do. He's in Fukushima." And he said, there's such mixed information coming out from this. He said, nobody really understands what radiation is. Would the two of you be willing to do a book? We said, at the time, it shows you the sense of hope that you can have in the book business sometimes. He said, this was April. He said, if you guys could do this in a hurry, we could make an ebook out of it. We could have this out in October, 4 months. And we said, oh, sure. Well, we can do that. Year and a half later, because one of the problems about trying to explain radiation is that nothing is linear in it. It's not, if you get this much, then that much will happen. There are an enormous number of things that have to be taken into account. And so for us to really explain this took a great deal of time. But the book interested us both because Bob was finding just, tremendous difference in the kinds of opinion, the kinds of information that people were being given, and was sort of frustrated by it. And so we set out to do something that really tried to cover the waterfront, at least in a superficial way, of everything from radiation accidents like Chernobyl and Fukushima to skin cancer, to mammograms, to medical treatment, trying to explain just the value of radiation in our lives, trying to show what's natural, what is man-made. One of the more astonishing things that, for me, in coming out of this, is to realize that about 80% of the man-made radiation that we receive is for medical tests of one kind or treatments. 50 years ago, our absorbed radiation was about half of what it is now, because there was really nothing being used for medicine. And that number is only growing. And so one of the Bob had a very funny thing he wrote to me the other day. He said, let's write an op-ed that says, should I use that gift certificate for a CT scan that I got for Christmas? And the answer is probably not. You get a tremendous amount of radiation from a CT scan. They are terrific diagnostic tools. If you need one, there is nothing better to get, by all means. If you're curious about whether you have something, don't do it. You're getting probably 5 to 6 times the amount of radiation that you would normally receive in a year from that. So it's not something you want to take lightly. One of the other things that's sort of curious about this, too, and an understanding, is, as you were saying, and I certainly agree with, our fears of radiation are kind of they're amorphous and irrational. We know it's kind of something to be feared. at the same time, I think one of the reasons that is so problematic is you can't see it, you really can't feel it. You can get a sunburn, which is radiation damage, but for the most part, if our hand is close to a fire, we pull it away because we know it's a danger. If we're standing on a precipice, we stand back because we don't fall. But the fact is, you could be standing in front of a radiotherapy machine that had been opened, and you could receive a large dose of radiation and not feel it. So it's a kind of scary thing in that regard.
It brings to mind a particularly chilling story that opens the book in Brazil, where these thieves break into an abandoned hospital, I guess it is, and break open this scanning machine and then proceed to sprinkle the radioactive material throughout the village, resulting in fewer deaths than I expected, but a lot of trouble. Maybe this is my own misconception about radiation. I thought, sprinkle that dust somewhere, everybody dies within a 10-mile radius.
Right. You think of some sort of poison fairy dust, that everybody's going to be put into a deep coma and then die. The point of the story is this is in Goiânia, Brazil, in 1987, a year after Chernobyl. Is that by the time this was done, there were about 100,000 people who, in one way or another, had been exposed to this cesium that had been left around. Some quite critically, but about 215 people who really need to be washed off and kind of disinfected from it. There were about 14 who were taken to Rio to be treated. These were the people who had really handled this the most, rubbed it on their bodies and various things. But what was so interesting about this is that if you look at it, here's this thing that's all the makings of a horror movie and a catastrophe. Mm-hmm. There were 3 or 4 deaths. Those came from the people who were really handling the cesium, putting it on their bodies, and in one case, actually eating it because it was on their hands and they were eating with their hands and putting it in, so that they were just completely poisoned by it. But you look at all of this radioactive material that was spread around. All these people were one way or another touched by it. And in fact, you had only 3 or 4 deaths, truly unfortunate. There were some houses that needed to be cleaned up. There was material that was buried outside town in a safe place. But in fact, overall, what you would think to be this gigantic catastrophe that could kill off a town, a few people died. There have been no incidents of cancer in those who were affected following up, and that Bob and the others who treated the patients in Rio, who were radioactive, they had the radioactive material inside them. So the way to do that was to treat them from behind a lead shield, and they made certain they had no pregnant women or women of childbearing age, because there could be damage that would be done to them. So of those who were working on the team, they finally said after the first day, we can't treat these people like this. So they just basically exposed themselves to what was coming off. Now, Bob has treated people like this. He was in a helicopter over the reactor at Chernobyl, has been in radioactive situations for the last 30 years.
It seems like he's been in all the major ones.
He's in all the major. They bring him in for all. He's a go-to guy for this. And he doesn't glow in the dark. He has had no adverse health effects from it. It's interesting is that you think that one touch of it and you're gone. And the fact is that it's not. It's not like that. One of the things that we realize too is that we know enough in general about radiation to be dangerous about it. So you know that iodine-131, we all know apparently iodine-131 can cause thyroid cancer. We know that because after Fukushima, you could not find a potassium iodide tablet anywhere on the West Coast. The radiation is coming this way. We're all going to get thyroid poisoning, and the reason that you take iodine for potassium iodine tablets to protect against thyroid cancer is that the thyroid collects iodine. For the Japanese, they're generally pretty topped up. They have an iodine-rich diet. Americans do too, for the most part. But what you want to do is make sure it's completely topped off, because if you get some iodine-131, which is radioactive and can cause thyroid cancer, then it will go and settle in the thyroid. If your thyroid is all topped off, basically it's the 131 is like a car looking for a place to park. If it can't find room in your thyroid, it's going to go someplace else. But the fact is that the cloud from the released gases that came across the ocean and goes into the stratosphere, had so little that it was depositing over here, is that people in California or on the West Coast buying potassium iodide to protect against iodine-131 for Fukushima could just as well have gone off and bought raincoats to protect against showers falling in Barcelona.
It was never going to make it.
It wasn't going to hurt you. You weren't going to get it. So we try to explain what this is. One of the we've done a couple of talks now when we've gone out and we've sort of asked people to raise their hands, and you say, how many people do you think have died as a result of the Chernobyl accident? 1,000, 20,000. You'll get numbers 20,000 people, 50,000 people. There have been press reports of 1 million people dying from it. 29 people died in the inferno and the explosion, or in the aftermath of being so poisoned. Two people fell to their deaths in the explosion, and their bodies they're not recovered. There were 30 million people in the direct path of the cloud coming from Chernobyl, and these were unfortunately subsistence farmers, really, and especially in Belarus, but also Ukraine, parts of Russia, who were eating the cesium-137, iodine-131 that was coming because it's falling on the grass. Their cows, sheep are eating the grass. They're absorbing that. It's coming out in their milk. It's in their meat. If they're eating that, it's going into the leaves of their vegetables. And one of the great tragedies of Chernobyl was that it was 2 weeks before the Soviet government really spread the word, acknowledged that this had happened. So the people in the path of this who couldn't be evacuated. They had iodine poor diets. They couldn't get potassium iodide tablets to them. So you would think that of these 30 million people, there would be a tremendous number of deaths. So far, 26 years after the event, there have been around 6,000 to 7,000 cases of thyroid cancer, of which there have been about 15 deaths. And the feeling is that the number over the years might rise to somewhere between 10 and 25 or 30,000. Again, most of those would be cured. So that the idea of the catastrophe is so great, but the overall health effects are surprisingly, to me anyway, smaller than you would ever imagine from it. Now, that doesn't mean you should go out and start eating iodine-131 or you should start getting extra CAT scan. The point we make in here quite clearly is, radioactive radiation does give you cancer. You want to do everything you can not to have any extra radiation. But that the damage that comes from the catastrophes we're dealing with are surprisingly smaller than we might imagine.
These stories of the iodine tablet shelves emptying in California, or of the Brazilian thieves sprinkling radioactive dust around, or, one of my favorites is a story I remember my mom telling from childhood all the time, from her childhood, telling me in my childhood of the petoscan machines and in shoe stores, which is unbelievable now, showing x-raying your feet to get a shoe correct. What kind of a wealth of telling stories of human ignorance about radiation were you working with here? I imagine there are many, and you found the most telling, put them in the book, but they had to be everywhere.
One of the things that's interesting about radiation, it started off as a curiosity. It was a fascinating thing. People were really, it was almost kind of like a toy. It was this magical toy that you could play with. The notion of and people with some rheumatological diseases go sit in radon caves, which emit a great deal of radiation. We can come back to radon in a minute. Actually, just as an aside here, radon is probably the single greatest cause of cancer for any of us. Now, it's naturally occurring. It's in earth and rocks. If you have a house with a basement, have it checked out. There's a test that you can do and you get a kit, send it to the EPA for evaluation. If the radon is collecting in your basement, in fact, it's something you will be inhaling, and it's the greatest, as I say, the greatest sort of single cause of cancer causing things for us. It's easy to mitigate and an easy test to do. So rather than worry about backscatter machines at the airport, which we can come to later, check out your basement for radon. Until World War II, for instance, it was kind of a benign curiosity. And even following World War II, the petoscopes, as you mentioned, which was the brand name for them, yes, you could go in there, you could look at your toes in your shoe to do my toes fit properly. And of course, while you're getting yours done, everybody in your family is running, let me put my feet through here too. And you're getting, you could get up to, half your year's amount of radiation just from sticking your feet in there for a minute.
Did you have any first-hand memories of these machines?
I remember. I put my own feet in them,
yes.
Yes. Somebody asked us the other night whether the arthritis that they had in their toes came from the petoscope machine. And Bob's answer to this was no, that radiation doesn't seem to have much to do with arthritis. But it is kind of astonishing is that you think of this as this kind of, wonderful toy. There's quite tragic case of in the early part of the 20th century is that watches used to have radium dials, so you could see them, which glowed in the dark, and they had next to the little green numbers. And these were hand painted by usually women with tiny hands. They were called radon girls. And to get the point of the brush just right, they would lick it with their tongue. And then they could then dip it into the pot of radium. Well, they were suddenly finding out they were getting jaw cancer as a result of this. And the Radium Company of America, which produced all this, behaved quite scandalously in doing this, in denying that this was at all dangerous for them. When some of them banded together and brought a lawsuit, they accused them of having syphilis and any number of other things. It was really quite a scandalous case, and the company really did know for its own executives, to stay away from it, but allowed these young women to really poison themselves, and many died as a result. So we found, however, in this time when it's gone from kind of this nice benign curiosity, in some ways we've overreacted on the other side. One of the things about Fukushima, for instance, when we talk about the earthquake and the problems in Japan from March 11th of 2011, we tend to forget that the earthquake and the ensuing tsunami, the earthquake moved the entire island of Honshu, the main island of Japan, 8 feet to the east. It drowned 20,000 people. It's left 300,000 people temporarily or permanently homeless. It created just enormous psychological havoc for many people. People within sort of the 30-kilometer exclusion zone around Fukushima were evacuated. It's tragic what's happened to them. There will be a lot of cleanup that's necessary in the ground around there. But the fact is that no one has died from radiation poisoning, even workers in the plant. And that, as I mentioned earlier, the follow-up that Bob and other scientists have done in Japan and the numbers that are accepted by them is there will be few, if any, cancers that follow through on this. But the notion of this plant being breached as it was and this radiation being released overshadows the real tragedy of the earthquake, which is the physical damage that was done and the number of villages that were wiped out and people left homeless again. And as I say, 20,000 people drowned from this.
Near the top of the list of misconceptions that I think this book corrects is that nuclear weapons and nuclear plant explosions, they don't cause most of their damage by the radiation. They cause it by the actual fires, the actual explosions, the actual concussive force. And a nuclear plant breached it doesn't contain a nuclear bomb, correct?
Right. You can't, if there's a nuclear plant is not going to explode in the way that a nuclear bomb would. It will have a fire, it will have an explosion, but the explosion is from steam or from gas, and it is not an atomic reaction that's going on. I did before writing this book. I kind of assumed that the people who died in the bombs of Hiroshima and Nagasaki died from radiation poisoning of one kind or another. But the fact is about 10% of the deaths were that. The largest, by far the greatest majority of deaths come from the same effect as any bomb. It's a massive explosion. There's a fire that follows. Buildings fall in on you. You're hit by flying shrapnel, and people die from that, and quite horribly. The thing about a nuclear explosion, of course, is that it's just so much greater. A single bomb can do so much, but the fact that the number of the effect of in terms of, we did a firebombing of Tokyo. The Allied forces did. It killed as many people. It just this one bomb was these bombs are so effective, and of course they're tiny by the standards of what we have now. And what's happened as a result of the bombs is that for the last 60 years now, there's been extensive follow-up of the survivors. And one of the things we know, one of the reasons we know as much as we do about radiological damage to humans, is following these people through the course of their lives.
It is a chapter people will turn to first, the radiation and cancer chapter, because there's the intersection of two fears, radiation and cancer. Are we afraid of those two things in the same amorphous, not particularly well-informed way?
Yes, I think that there is yes, a concern in both of those. One thing we need to start off about cancer is that for American men, you have about a 44% chance of developing cancer in your lifetime. That doesn't mean you'll die from it, but 44% men are going to have a cancer. The figure's about 38%, 39% for women. So you're starting off with a pretty high baseline for where this is going to occur. So now you start looking at what is the cause of what's causing cancer on top of this. Skin cancers are developing at a frighteningly high and accelerated rate because with global warming and as the ozone layer decreases more and more, more UVB rates are coming, more UVB rays are coming through, which can cause skin cancer. And skin cancers and melanoma are really something to be very concerned about. You mentioned earlier about suntan lotion, about sunscreen. It's advisable to wear sunscreen all the time when you go out, to wear dark glasses as much as you can just to prevent against rays. One of the things that we worry about is melanoma, which is the most serious and most deadly and kind of the quietest of skin cancers. We all as adults go out and kind of slather sunscreen on ourselves. One of the things that we learned about that is that if you're going to get melanoma, it's likely you will set the mechanism in motion before you're 10 or 11 years old. There are studies done of children who have families who have moved, say, from England, where it's a low sunlight country in comparison to Australia, is that those who came before the age of 10 had kind of the same incidences of cancer as those living in Australia. People who came afterward had a lower incidence, and so it just seems that the body is really kind of programmed to take this in early on. So it's advisable to put it on your children. For somebody my age, I'm in my 60s. I never used sunscreen as a kid. I in fact put baby oil on to make the suntan better. So it's just inviting trouble. But people think that they're protecting against melanoma later in life. What you're really protecting against is all sorts of other skin cancers as well. But unfortunately, melanoma is pretty much set in motion, as we've seen by the age of 10. But there are plenty of other skin cancers that you want to protect against, and by all means, it's important to wear sunscreen.
Why are we so afraid of cell phones?
Well, I think that you hear it's like ghost stories of one kind or another. You hear somebody says, gosh, I've got this thing next to my head, and I'm going to get a glioma as a result of this because of all these rays coming through. Anything, and the phone gets hot when it's sitting there. We go into this in some detail. There are no studies that have come out that show any convincing correlation between cell phone usage and cancers. We're really talking about radio waves. We talk a lot about the electromagnetic spectrum, and from one end to the other, radio waves are very low on it. When you start getting up toward at the end with gamma rays, which are terribly, terribly dangerous, you've got troubles. But there's nothing convincing that shows that radio waves are in any way cancer producing.
There's something in that about. I want to touch on as well this fact that you get more radiation by taking a plane and by going through the scanner. How much of the conversations you were having with Dr. Gale were about just our fears of the wrong things? Right.
There are plenty. We worry about odd things. Any number of your friends, I'm sure, and mine for certain, say, well, what is it about the back scanner machine? What kind of radiation am I going to get from this? You're getting a minuscule amount that goes through, and the fact is, the first 5 minutes you're in the air, you're going to get more radiation that comes through the plane than you got from the back scanner, because as the plane goes higher, there's less to stop the ultraviolet rays that are coming through, and all people on planes pick up radiation on the course of their trip. There have been a number of studies done on pilots and flight attendants to see if there's any excess cancers in them. There are a couple of studies that show that there may be some with female flight attendants. It's not particularly clear on that yet. If it is, it's not a very great amount. so that when you're flying, and I fly 100,000 miles a year, and Bob flies probably twice as much of that, we know we're getting excess radiation, and it does add to our total for the year, but lots of people fly vast distances all the time, and there doesn't seem to be much, if even a perceptible increase in the cancers for passengers.
Your book on bone marrow transplantation was about the frontier of medicine, about the cutting edge, and your book on penicillin was about the history of medical science as well. But tell me about how this book, how it differed for you writing, I suppose, a primer about something to do with science and to do with medical science as well. How do you see this in relation to your other medical science related books?
This one was completely different. The benefit of Life and Death on 10 West is the story of a 26-year-old woman 6 months pregnant with her first child who was discovered to have leukemia. And it was about what happens next. And it's like 60 minutes. There's a stopwatch that begins with telling the story. You can stop and take the commercial break by talking about the doctors or the nurses or giving medical history on what goes on. You can tell stories about that, and then you go back into the story of her. So it's very novelistic. You have a character, something's happening to her. There's going to be resolution. There's a beginning, a middle, and an end to this. So in that regard, it's a much simpler book to write because you can use a narrative and novelistic form on it, even though everything is truly factual. The same with The Mold in Dr. Florey's Coat. Here was this wonderful medical story, a kind of a mystery that goes to it. There are these wonderful characters. Mm-hmm. So you could tell the story of these people, and by doing that, linking it to the events that goes on, again, you can take kind of a narrative novelistic approach to it. So those books were much easier, and even though they were very difficult to write, they were much easier than this. Here, Bob and I were stuck with a lot of facts. Hi, we're going to tell you about radiation now, and here's what it's going. And I found that as I was going through this, I'd have periods where I was just completely unable to get anything down. Mm-hmm. And I had said to myself, what's the matter with you? This isn't rocket science. Let's get this down. And one day, when giving myself this lecture, I said, in answer, you said, you're right. It's not rocket science, but it is nuclear physics. Mm-hmm. And nuclear physics turns out to be a difficult thing to write about. There's a lot to try to explain. And so I was saved in the telling of this book by Bob's stories, which are kind of, because they put a human face on it. One of the stories I love most about it is that he was in Moscow treating the victims of Chernobyl. There were clinical animal trials going on with a human growth hormone that they were certain were going to help with producing granulocytes, which had been killed and are essential to the blood. And these firemen and the others who had severe radiation poisoning were going to die without something quite magical, something new to help them out. They had not been tried on humans yet, but they were ready to go. But the Russian government was not, the Soviet government was not willing to have Soviet citizens used as guinea pigs for this. And you could understand they were having a lot of trouble with it. They were having a lot of bad PR as it was anyway. The last thing they wanted to do was this. And so Bob said, fine, we'll do the first trial on me. And and he talked to his Soviet counterpart who said, well, fine, I'll inject you, but you have to inject me. The two of us are going to go through this together. So they looked at all the data that they had from trials in monkeys and figured out how much they had to give each other, and they injected each other. And they said they'd come back in the morning and take their blood counts, and by then, if the granulocytes were up, they would know that they were okay, and then this was safe to try on humans. So Bob goes off to dinner at the American ambassador's house, and while he is there, he gets a phone call. Dr. Vorobiev is his counterpart, saying Vorobiev is in critical condition in the hospital. Perhaps you want to come over. And Bob's going, oh my goodness, this, if he dies, it's really unfortunate for him, and it's also really unfortunate for the patient. He said, and he gets there, and people are around him. Vorobiev is white as a sheet, and he's clutching his chest, and it looks like he's had a heart attack. But they can't find it on an EKG. And Bob starts talking to him and realizes that what's happening is that his sternum, his breastbone, where there is a good supply of bone marrow, is hurting him. It's not his heart. And what's happening is the growth factor is kind of squeezes the bone marrow in there to push out the granulocytes. And he was feeling the pain of that. It's well documented now, having been used on thousands and thousands of patients, that this is the case. But the monkeys hadn't told them this. So they had no idea that this could happen. So Vorobiev turns out to be all right. They inject the patients, and it's of some benefit to others. And when Bob was in Goiânia, in Rio, treating the Goiânia patients, they were able to use it in some of the victims there, and it was helpful to them. And now it's a common prescription.
In that dramatic moment of the story, when Dr. Gale gets the call that the Russian doctor is in critical condition, you told us the thoughts you wrote about him having. You don't write about him having the thought, maybe I'm next, maybe I'm about to go as well. I mean, I'm sure that thought must have come to mind, but it illustrates in the book. The man is this is a man very much focused on his subject. I would imagine from the descriptions of him in here, tell me if I'm right or not, that he would really think, oh, this is going to impede what we're going to learn about radiation more, before he would think, I might die from this.
Well, he was, it's largely true. I think that he wouldn't knowingly stand in front of something that he was convinced was going to kill him. But he was so convinced from one of his colleagues at UCLA, David Goldie, had been doing the work on this, and he was quite familiar with it. And it was very clear that this was something that had tremendous benefit to it. And he was quite convinced that this was not going to harm humans. And what was interesting in his case is that he had no symptoms whatsoever. But Vorobiev did. And so but I think that he was willing to take a calculated risk on there. He said, we have people here who are going to die if we don't do something. The only something we can do outside of what we've been able to do is to give them some of this growth factor. Therefore, let's test it on us, and we'll go forward from there. So he's a very courageous guy, and he's very determined he fights for his patients and is determined to get people through things.
How much of your interest in writing about medical science has to do with writing about people who are fixated on their pursuit, who are perhaps obsessed with pushing forward whatever it is they're doing? Because these figures pop up in your books about medical science, and indeed, on the other half of your bibliography, you're writing about Woody Allen, a man who people think of as obsessed with his craft. How much is, I suppose, pure obsession to do with who you want to write about?
Almost every book I've done has been accidental. Life and Death on 10 West came about because I was looking to do something about the frontier of medicine, and I have no medical background. I was a failed science student in school. I was really hopeless. And I realized that if I was going to write about this, I needed to know somebody in a hospital, and I realized that I knew Bob Gale at UCLA. And so went to see him, and I was interested in writing about I was doing this for a magazine at the time, and the editor and I thought the brain research would be interesting. So I went to see Bob, and he said, here are all the things on brain. And I said, well, what do you do? And he said, I run the bone marrow transplant service. And I said, what's a bone marrow transplant? And he told me, and I went, this is kind of more interesting than brain research right now. So that's how I just came to that story. The mold in Dr. Florey's coat was I was reading an obituary in the New York Times of a woman who had died and was the first recipient in America. Was the first recipient of penicillin in the U.S. In the course of reading it, it talked about Alexander Fleming, whom everybody knows, but kind of by the time you got to the end of it, it made the point that, well, actually, Fleming didn't make it into the penicillin that we can all take. It was his team at Oxford. And I went, well, wait a minute, I don't know anything about that. There's kind of a mystery here. And the more I looked into it, the more wonderful the mystery story was. And so that allowed me to do it. The nice thing about that book was that I became friendly with the last living member of the team there, who was a meticulous diarist. And he had never opened his diaries to anybody, to any of the scientific institutes. He'd taken out all of the scientific stuff that he had kept. But it was a wealth of personal material. It was the lives of the people in the lab at the time, and their pettiness and their grandiosity in some cases, and their fabulous science on the others, and the wonderful things that they were able to do to each other. It was just this great human story, and so that allowed me to really bring people into the book because you were seeing it through the lives of these very driven people who were quite dedicated in what they were doing. Woody Allen is, as you say, everyone knows him to be kind of this obsessive guy. He's completely different from the person you see on the screen. The guy on the screen is kind of hapless and has no control over his life. And Woody is not hapless and has control over every aspect of his life and especially of his work. But he is as dedicated to where I have seen this, where he finished making a movie in the morning. He'd done the last of the edits and all the sound was mixed. It was finally ready. He said, okay, we're done. He went home. He had lunch. He went up to his room. He got down on the bed where he writes and started working on his next script that afternoon. It was not, I guess I'll take the afternoon off and go to a movie or something. It's, okay, now it's time to start writing the next one.
Are you on to, as accidental as they may be, are you on to your own next projects in a similar fashion where it's one immediately follows the next, or your curiosity is turned towards something else soon after a book?
It's wonderful when there's something to do immediately after it. That's almost never happened. There is that moment of where, unlike Woody, who looks up and says, "Oh, I'm done. Oh, good. It's 11 o'clock. I'll get a sandwich and now I can get started on the next." I look up and go, "Oh God, now what now?" So
your previous book, Faith Interrupted, dealt with your separation from religious belief. And it's a story, there is a story that I hear from many friends who are former believers. They will say, their belief didn't survive their first round of biology classes in college, something like that. How much did what you learned writing about medicine, about biology, about medical science affect the way you believed or stopped believing?
Actually, that had almost nothing to do with it. I came from a family that believed in evolution and that it was quite sort of separated from the spirituality, from any belief in God. It had more to do with just as my life unfolded and the experiences that I had, and the more that I was able to think about things and experience them, is that I just couldn't reconcile the faith that I had as a kid, that I had kind of so unflinchingly and so happily, and that I had well into my 20s, that I could never hold it together. And I've thought in the past that it may have been because I was kind of so rigid in that belief, that it was something that I accepted so wholly and so easily, is that it just didn't withstand. It could be altered some, but it couldn't be taken apart and put back together.
How much does the concept of what we believe, this is so broad, and I'm going to refine it, but what we believe versus what is true. I mean, even in the radiation book, you're doing so much to counter beliefs that just sort of, we're not sure how they form, but they're misconceptions about radiation or about cancer or about the scanner machines at the airport. Do you have an interest in purely that, in the sense that we think a lot of things, not a lot of them are true? How do we separate?
I think that with the penicillin book, with the mold in Dr. Fleury's coat, there was a wonderful record. There was a way to set the record straight about some things, to make the story more complete than people had thought. So that part was fun. This was, in talking with Bob as we were sorting out what to do, is that what we think and what we know are two such different things, especially with radiation, that the challenge and the pleasure in doing this was to say, let's try to put this into perspective. Here is something that can easily kill you. Do not start messing around with it. We're not trying in any way to suggest that this is not something to be concerned about. But it is something that's critical to our lives, that it plays a huge role in what we do. There are ways to avoid danger, and to try to put this into perspective so that rather than for all of us to go around with these kind of vague notions of dread about that, and not particularly well formed, except that, oh my God, it's terrible and what's going to happen, is that if you're really going to be worried about that, is that we'll give you some really specific things that you can be really worried about, and some other things you don't need to be worried about at all. Try to put them so that if you want to worry about radiation, we'll give you plenty to worry about, because it's something that you can do something about. The rest of the stuff, try not to sweat it, because there are plenty of other things to worry about. And one of the things being, we talk about the backscatter machine. We've come back to that a couple of times. if it's a given that radiation causes cancer, then we have to accept the fact that even the small amount of radiation that comes from a backscatter machine, multiplied by 1 billion people getting it over the course of time, that as a result of this, there will be an instance or two of cancer that's come along out of this. It's just the way the numbers work on it. At the same time, the radiation the amount that you're getting in the airplane is so significantly more that may be something you want to be concerned about.
You mentioned going to public events with Dr. Gale and talking about this book, getting questions from the public. How much of a reaction? What sort of a reaction do you get from a book like this? Is it, I'm glad there's finally a primer on this sort of thing, or is it like, well, I don't know. I have my own ideas about radiation. I don't know if these align with them. What kind of vibe do you get from the public about a book like this?
It's complicated. Our fears are so well embedded in us that to come along and have somebody say, "Well, worry about this. Don't worry so much about that." It's hard to change that mindset that goes on. And so I was talking with somebody who we were at the LA Public Library for the Allowed series the other night. And we'd gone through this, and I had a nice note from one of the people there saying, it all made a lot of sense, but I still have these vague, sort of radiogenic fears that I don't know what to do about. It's hard to put the two of them together. So I think that to try to take a new mindset about something that's been such a fearful thing for us is difficult to do, and it's hard to accept. If you've thought that millions have died after Chernobyl, or 1 million people have died after Chernobyl, and you find out that that the World Health Organization and others are saying basically we're talking about 6,000 to 7,000 thyroid cancers so far, 15 deaths, and perhaps twice as many over the next 30 or 40 years, that it's hard. It's just hard to balance the two of those things. So that's been interesting to see is people say, well, thank you so much for telling me this. I'm still I still can't quite get over my fears. But we've had our fears for a long time, and you've had this information for an hour. So, it's hard to...
Tell me about the conversation you had with Dr. Gale as far as specifically, we're coming up against some controversial issues here in this book. Nuclear power, irradiated foods, even the issues of what causes cancer are politicized to some degree. What conclusion did you come to as far as how to deal with those in a way where you wouldn't shut people down to receiving the information you needed to give them?
Because as we went through this, we tried not to be we're not trying to be an apologist for anything, and our hope is that if we annoy people on both sides, that we really will have done our job right. Yeah. And so that was the thing in there. We were trying to be very careful not to editorialize, not to say we think this is better than that, and things like on whether irradiated food is dangerous, in which to us the science is very clear. We do say that it's not something to be concerned about, and there are plenty of reasons to be grateful for it as opposed to be worried about it, because it does kill off all of the bacteria that cause food poisoning. There are hundreds of millions of cases of food poisoning a year around the world that could be alleviated by, in fact, irradiating food. And people will say, well, it's got the radiation in it. It's now radioactive food, but it's no more radioactive than your teeth are after you've had a dental X-ray. It's passed through. It's not there anymore. You're not in any danger from this, but the dangerous things that were in there have in fact been killed by it. So we do sort of come out strongly on that. On the others, we tend to take it's all we want to do is just lay out the facts, whatever, and they're the best medical and scientific facts that are out there. We've checked them all. We've made our decision that this is a very comfortable place for us to be. There will be people on either sides of the question who may come after us. Although what's been interesting so far is that no one has taken exception.
Really?
The scientific community has been generous in its response. So who knows? But I'm sure somebody's going to be offended and unhappy, and I'm sure we'll hear from them.
Having written this book with Dr. Gale, tell me, for you personally, do Do you find you are relieved of a certain burden of fears about radiation and its dangers, or are you thinking more now? Oh, well, I know better that that's dangerous and that's not. Are you thinking more or less about the dangers of radiation? Is it a relief, or sort of are you more watchful now?
Well, I know what to be careful about much more than I did when I started it. So, in fact, I'm doing that. I have just in my own medical care at the present, there's something that needs to be looked at that can be done with an MRI. I'm happy to have an MRI. There's no radiation in that. If a CT scan were needed to do it, I'd ask a lot more questions of the doctor to see if it was really necessary. And I think that's one of the things that where people get are not kind of managed in their balance about concern about this. And as I say, people will be much more concerned about backscatter radiation than they will be about a CT scan, which gives thousands of times more radiation than it comes down. And so what we all need to do is just be aware of the amount. And your doctor needs to be able to say to you, if you ask, what kind of radiation do I get from this? And the doctor needs to say that. And if the doctor can't supply you with this information, then you may be at the wrong doctor.
And your readers may do well to accept the fact that they don't control nuclear weapon deployment. They don't control exploding reactors. They do control whether they get radon tests in the basement. They do control whether they get a CT scan. There's this sense that you need to know what you can, accept the things you accept what you can change and change what you can't. That whole thing. Right?
Yeah, exactly. So is that also, as I think what we need to do, and we talk about both the drawbacks and the advantages of nuclear energy and nuclear power, is that the difference is you start thinking about the people who die as a result of accidents. The only deaths in a nuclear reactor so far are the people who died at Chernobyl. If you look at the deaths in mining coal, for instance, and the transport of coal, 100,000 miners over the last century in America, 6,000 a year in China now for that, is that you start thinking that, well, maybe one source of energy might be more deadly than another, even though there's no doubt that a super catastrophe of a nuclear meltdown could be very dangerous. But on the other hand, we've kind of seen what that can do. And it's hard to have anything worse than what happened in Chernobyl. There was an exclusion zone that's around there now that is, but it is coming back to life in ways that people hadn't quite experienced, hadn't quite expected. And that the great boogeymen around this may not be quite as great as we think. Again, the dangers of nuclear energy and nuclear waste and radioactive waste is that it sticks around for a long time, 250,000 years. That's a long time. On the other hand, there are many toxins that come out of coal and other fossil fuels that have an equally long shelf life of damage and that are out in the environment are being kept in a careless way, getting back into the water. And so that all hazardous waste is something that needs to be carefully rounded up and quarantined and kept away from people. And for many of the failures of the nuclear industry, one thing they're doing better than anybody else is keeping their waste under better lock and key than most. One of the reasons for that is how small the amount is by comparison. If you were to take all of the nuclear, high-level nuclear waste that's around, it would fill a football field to about 20 feet. Now, you actually wouldn't want to stack it up because you could probably start a chain reaction there. But the fact is, it's a manageable amount of material when you think of it. And if you look at slag heaps from coal or from other uses, it's a tremendous amount of waste that gets spread around the environment.
I won't say this book is pro-nuclear power in the end, but it's maybe less of a worry than some might think. Can we say that?
Yes, and one of the things that we argue for very strongly in the book is that it's incumbent upon governments and nuclear energy producers to follow the most stringent safety regulations possible. One of the alarming things that came out of Fukushima was that safety regulations were not being enforced as well as they should be. That, this plant withstood a tremendous shock in terms of both of the massive earthquake, and then the earthquake really didn't cause the problems. It was a tsunami coming in and this huge thing coming over 40-foot high walls that finally led to the problems there. But in fact, there may have been things that could have prevented that had the regulations been followed as they were supposed to be. And we're very much in favor of the most stringent regulations of safety regulations on there. I used to worry about nuclear plants all the time. I would think, oh my God, what are we doing with this? But a properly run, if you're standing in Grand Central Terminal, or standing next to the U.S. Capitol, you'll receive more radiation from the radon in the rocks than you will inside a properly running nuclear power plant. And most of them are properly running. Again, not saying that they're done perfectly and that there's plenty more that needs to be done in there, but it is something that can be contained in a way larger than I think we give it credit for.
If the information, if people have the information, if agencies have the information, if countries have the information, it's all about spreading the information, is it not?
Right, and none of what we're saying in there, and certainly not what I'm saying now, is that nuclear energy is the answer to everything. There are plenty of alternative energies, but if you look at a world in which we are now 7 billion people and exponentially more people demanding electricity than we've ever had before, if we're going to produce the electricity people we need, every form of productions of mass quantities of electricity have drawbacks to them and have great dangers to them. From coal and from fossil fuels, it's greenhouse gases, it's pollution of the landscape and the air. You get more radiation if you live near a coal burning power plant than you do if you live next to a nuclear power plant. The danger, of course, is that, a nuclear accident can be quite catastrophic, but so can others. So we argue for a kind of a very balanced approach to all sorts of energy consumption, and we are energy production, with the knowledge that we are living in a planet in surrounding that planet, we have put the largest toxic waste dump in the solar system with all of the carbon and greenhouse gases that we put up there, and that stands a much greater chance of doing us huge harm as a civilization than almost anything else.
I've been speaking here at the Los Angeles Review of Books headquarters with Eric Lax, co-author with Robert Peter Gale, MD, of Radiation, What It Is, What You Need to Know, as well as books on Woody Allen, Paul Newman, penicillin, bone marrow transplantation, and his own spiritual journey. Eric, thanks so much.
Thanks so much for having me, Colin. It was a pleasure.
This has been the Los Angeles Review of Books podcast. Find much more at lareviewofbooks.com. Thanks.